There is a kind of person who notices things others miss. They feel the tension in a room before anyone has spoken. They sense when a colleague is struggling behind a professional smile. When someone cries, they do not look away. When someone is in pain, their first instinct is to move toward it, not away from it. These people are not naive. They are not weak. They are, by most measures, emotionally sophisticated in ways that take others decades to develop, if ever. And they are disproportionately targeted by people who exploit exactly that. This episode is not about labeling anyone. It is not about diagnosing the people who hurt you or building a case against someone you know. It is about understanding a pattern that repeats across relationships, across cultures, across decades of documented cases. A pattern with a mechanism. And like all mechanisms, once you understand how it works, it loses some of its power over you. The question we are starting with is this: why does the person with the most capacity for compassion so often end up in the most controlled relationship? To answer that, we have to go back to something foundational about how manipulation actually operates. Manipulation, at its core, is not about force. Force is obvious. Force leaves marks people can point to. Covert manipulation works differently. It works by constructing a version of reality that the target co-creates without realizing it. The manipulator does not drag someone into a distorted world. They build that world slowly, using the target's own values as the building material. Researchers and practitioners who study coercive control consistently observe the same entry point. A person's greatest strength becomes the primary lever. And for someone with a high degree of empathy, that strength is their ability to feel responsible for the emotional states of people around them. Think about what that actually means in practice. When someone who is highly empathic enters a relationship with a person who uses manipulation, the empathic person brings a set of operating assumptions to that relationship. They assume that if someone is in pain, the pain is real. They assume that if someone seems vulnerable, the vulnerability is genuine. They assume that if they can understand someone's history well enough, they can help that person heal. These are not character flaws. They are the qualities we call compassion, patience, and emotional generosity. In most relationships, they are assets. In a relationship with someone who has learned to weaponize emotional need, they become the mechanism of control. Here is how the pattern typically begins. The early stage of these relationships is often described later as overwhelming. Not in a bad way at first. The person who will later become controlling tends to present an intensity of connection that feels like recognition, like finally being seen. They mirror the empathic person's values back to them. They describe a history of pain. They express a need, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied, to be truly understood. And the empathic person responds exactly as their nature would predict. They lean in. Robert Covert's work on manipulation techniques describes how skilled manipulators learn, often intuitively, to use emotional disclosure strategically. Vulnerability, real or performed, accelerates attachment. When someone shares something difficult about themselves early in a relationship, it creates a sense of intimacy that normally takes much longer to develop. For someone whose identity is partly organized around being a safe space for others, that accelerated intimacy feels like a gift. It feels like proof that this relationship is different. What is actually happening, in pattern terms, is the construction of an attachment bond under artificial conditions. The target is not falling for a lie, exactly. They are responding to signals their nervous system is designed to respond to: distress in another person, the invitation to help, the reward of feeling that their presence matters. These are ancient, deeply wired responses. They are not something a person should be ashamed of. The shame comes later, and that is by design. Once attachment is established, the dynamic shifts, not dramatically, not all at once. The shift tends to be gradual enough that each individual change seems explicable on its own terms. A bad day, a misunderstanding, a moment of insecurity. The empathic person, true to form, extends understanding. They find the explanation, they absorb the rupture. David Bennis, in his extensive writing on psychological warfare in relationships, identifies several behaviors that tend to appear in sequence during this phase. Accountability disappears. Inconsistency becomes a pattern. The target begins to feel that no matter how carefully they navigate the relationship, they are always slightly off. Always one step away from having done something wrong without knowing what it was. This is the beginning of what is sometimes called the gaslighting dynamic, though the term is used loosely enough now that it has lost some of its precision. What is actually happening is a systematic erosion of the target's confidence in their own perception. The person who once felt seen begins to feel unseen, not by the relationship, but by themselves. They doubt what they witnessed, they reinterpret their own memory. And because their primary coping strategy is empathy, their response to this confusion is to try harder to understand the person causing it. This is the trap at the center of the trap. The very capacity that made them a target, the drive to understand, to explain, to hold space for complexity, now keeps them locked in a cycle of justifying behavior that should not be justified. Richard Gardner's work on covert mind control describes this process in terms of cognitive restructuring. Over time, the target begins to adopt the manipulator's frame of reality, not because they are foolish, but because they have been systematically trained to distrust their own. Isolation tends to accompany this phase, though it rarely looks like isolation from the outside. It may look like the couple simply preferring each other's company. It may look like the target becoming less available to friends, attributing it to the demands of a difficult partner who needs them. The network contracts. The people who might offer outside perspective become less present, and the target becomes more dependent on the one relationship that is distorting their sense of what is real. Albert Stark's research on manipulation identification points to body language and behavioral incongruence as early signals that often go unregistered, partly because people who are highly empathic tend to prioritize the emotional content of what someone says over the physical signals that contradict it. A person can say "I love you" while their behavior systematically withdraws safety. The empathic person hears the words and works to resolve the contradiction internally, usually at their own expense. Then there is the mechanism that is perhaps the most difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. Intermittent reinforcement. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented psychological process in which unpredictable reward produces a stronger attachment response than consistent reward. It is the mechanism behind certain forms of addiction. It is the mechanism behind why slot machines are more compelling than vending machines. And it is, whether consciously or not, the mechanism behind the cycle of idealization and devaluation that characterizes many of these relationships. When warmth and withdrawal alternate without pattern, the nervous system does not disengage. It escalates its effort to regain the warmth. The target becomes hypervigilant. They read microexpressions, they adjust their behavior, they work to be the version of themselves that produces the good days. And when the good days come, they feel like earned proof that the relationship is worth it. Donald Goleman's writing on emotional manipulation notes that manipulators often understand at some functional level that they need to give the target what they want intermittently, not often enough to create security, but often enough to prevent exit. The empathic person's own emotional intelligence becomes a liability here, because they are sophisticated enough to remember the good, to contextualize the bad, and to construct a narrative of hope out of whatever material is available. Diana Brain's work on dark psychology and emotional patterns connects this to the deeper question of self-worth. Many people who display high empathy toward others carry a quiet, persistent belief that their own needs are secondary, that being loved requires being useful, that their value in a relationship is measured by how much they can absorb, fix, or withstand. This belief is not always conscious. It often originates well before the relationship in question, and a skilled manipulator, whether consciously or by instinct, finds it quickly. Frida Kahlo's analysis of persuasion and trust describes how the most effective manipulation builds not on the target's weakness, but on their commitment to their own values. An empathic person will stay in a harmful dynamic longer, not because they cannot feel the harm, but because leaving feels like a betrayal of the compassion that defines them. They believe that if they leave, they have failed the person who needed them. They believe that their discomfort is the price of love that is real and complicated, rather than easy and shallow. That belief, more than any external constraint, is often what keeps the door closed. Recognizing the pattern is not comfortable. It requires sitting with the possibility that the relationship you invested in, the one that felt like the deepest connection you had experienced, was in some significant part a constructed environment designed to keep you attached and off balance. That is a painful thing to acknowledge. It can produce grief that does not have the clean edges of ordinary loss. But recognition is also where the mechanism starts to lose its grip. The signals worth paying attention to are consistent over time and across cases. Your perception of events is regularly disputed, not gently corrected, but denied. Your emotional responses are characterized as excessive or irrational. Your access to other relationships has narrowed without you deciding to narrow it. You spend significant mental energy managing this person's emotional state at the cost of your own. You find yourself defending them to people who care about you. And when things are good, the relief you feel is so strong that it overrides your memory of how you got there. None of these signals, on their own, is definitive. Together, as a sustained pattern, they are worth taking seriously. If you are in a relationship where your safety or the safety of children in your care is at risk, please do not navigate that alone. Domestic violence hotlines exist in most countries specifically for this. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-7233 and online at thehotline.org. A trained advocate can help you think through your situation without pressure and without judgment. For those working through the aftermath, the research is clear on one thing. The traits that made you a target, your capacity for empathy, your tolerance for complexity, your impulse toward repair, are not the problem. They were misdirected. Redirected towards someone who treated them as a resource rather than a gift. The work is not to become less caring. It is to become more discerning about where that care goes. It is to extend to yourself the same understanding you have always extended to others. It is to recognize that leaving is not abandonment. It is not failure. It is, in some cases, the most honest act of self-knowledge a person can perform. The mind files these experiences not as proof of what you lack, but as evidence of what you were willing to endure in the hope of something real. That hope is not the problem either. It is, in fact, the thing worth protecting.